Hi everyone, my name is Marco Bucci. You may know me from my own YouTube channel, but I'm excited to be here today to give you a sneak peek at my new class, The Way from Fundamentals to Finished Paintings, available at creatureartteacher.com. In the full class, we'll get into composition, shape, design, color, lighting. I'll present lecture material as well as 3 different painting demonstrations with 3 different mediums to enforce the theme of good visual storytelling. So here's a sneak peek at the class. I hope you enjoy it. All right, here we are in Photoshop, which is my digital painting app of choice. The app you're using, by the way, doesn't matter. You can use anything you want. But here in Photoshop, I have my color picker open. And this is just one particular style of color picker. That's the circular kind. You could also make it a hue cube, which is actually the one I prefer to use. But they all do the same thing. You have your hues, which is your color names, in this case, a vertical hue strip. Or in the case of a color wheel, you have it in a literal circle color wheel, which is kind of more standard. And then somewhere within there, you have your ability to pick different values or lightness or darkness of a color, as well as your various saturations. Okay, so we've already got a few terms that I just threw out there that let's just make sure we're all on the same page with them. So the hue is just the color name, red, green, blue, orange, etc. It's as simple as that, the same stuff we learned in preschool. Saturation is how intense the color is, or in other words, how colorful the color is. On one end of saturation, you have the most colorful orange there is, and on the other end of that saturation scale, you have a very gray orange. And of course, that holds true for every hue. Value is a tonal consideration. It's the lightness or darkness of whatever color you happen to be choosing. So the lightest value would be white, and the darkest value would be black, and in between you have an entire range. This is what those 3 terms look like in a chart, isolated unto themselves. Now, the overall idea with using color is you are never dealing with just one of those things. Every color you pick has all 3. It's like a 3-dimensional consideration that you're doing. You pick a color, it has a hue, it has a saturation, and it has a value. And what makes color difficult is you're going to be picking a lot of colors, as you can imagine, in any given painting, be it digital or traditional. And the challenge of color is constantly comparing one color choice or one color that you're painting to another. And this chapter will focus on exactly that, using color with the constant comparison idea in mind. And as you'll see, that's the primary way that I like to achieve color harmony or appealing color in my work. Color harmony is a term that can be intimidating. At least I found it that way when I first started learning about color. So what is color harmony? At least as an overall idea, color harmony refers to the colors' relationships next to the surrounding colors in your image. Your image could be a photograph, a painting, abstract, realistic, whatever. It's the colors' relationships to all the other colors. That is really what we're controlling when we deal with color. Already that might be a bit of a shift from what you might be used to. When I first started painting, I thought color was all about picking the right color for something. Like, oh, I'm painting skin tone. This is the skin tone, exactly this color. But that's actually not what we're doing. A good color choice has way more to do with where the colors are coming from and where they are going. Which leads me to the second part of this slide here. Appealing color harmony involves traceable paths between various color temperatures. All right, a few more concepts introduced here. Let's quickly talk about them. Maybe the big one is color temperature. What is that? Well, we're going to look at it in just a second, but overall, you're dealing with warm colors and cool colors. Now, table that thought. We'll get right back to it, but warm versus cool is what color temperature is all about. And what we do is we constantly compare the relative warmth or coolness of a color with all the other colors. And then the other word here that I want to talk about quickly is the phrase traceable paths. This invokes motion. Colors are always moving, and that's the key theme I want you guys to take away when you're comparing colors. So we're comparing colors by tracing their movements. That is, how does one color temperature, be it warm or cool, The question you're asking yourself constantly is, how does one color temperature get to another, or get to its opposite? How does warm get to cool? How does cool get to warm? What are the intermediary phases it goes through? And that is how you develop what I call traceable paths between color temperatures. If you have that traceable path in your painting, the viewer will recognize it because our brains just are so used to digesting color information. We see it every day. If you can give the viewer a traceable path between your color temperatures, you will have good color in your painting. Or just another way to say that is, you will have good color harmony. When you look at the color wheel like this, probably the first thing you want is an overall impression as to where the stereotypical warm and cool colors live. By the way, I'm only looking at the circle right now, so let's just scratch this part out. We're not looking at this inner triangle thing right now. We're just looking at the outer color wheel itself. So this is what I mentioned earlier about this is kind of what we've probably all learned somewhere around grade school. And if you didn't, don't worry, it's very easy. The warm colors are like yellows and oranges and reds. In fact, I can broaden this circle a bit. In here, let's say W for warm. Okay, these are stereotypical warm colors. You're painting with a broad brush, no pun intended, but these are the warm colors of the color wheel. I don't think you can really argue with that. The cool colors are on the other side. You've got this kind of area here. Into the blues, you can expand the circle a little bit. Blues into the violets. They're opposites, right? So we will say C for cools. Now, what we want to do is traverse this through these leftover areas here. So we will be either going this way through the hue spectrum, or we can go this way through the hue spectrum. Now, this is a two-way street. I could go back this way or this way. And then from here, likewise, I can go either this way or that way. The way we travel from warm to cools, there's no rules. There's no set direction. You can go either way. You can go both ways. As long as you are thinking about the path you are taking, that's the important thing. You need to know how you're getting from warm to cool and vice versa. So right away here, let's start a little color chart. This is kind of a bridge between theory and practice. So obviously, we'll be doing a painting together using this stuff, but this is kind of the first step into actually painting something. So I want to go, I'll just put a W there for warm and a C here for cool. And I want to move from warm to cool using the hues, only the hues. Now, I need a starting point and an ending point. So I'll just pick one of my stereotypical warm colors, something in here, right? And I'll just pick this orangey color there, and I'll say, that's my warm color. If this were a painting, this is like the warmest color in my painting. And then I say, okay, well, when I go to the cool colors in my theoretical painting, I want to be over here at the end, somewhere in these very saturated blues. So I say, okay, there's my coldest color in the painting, is that. Now, this whole area is what we have to fill in, and we will do so now just with the hues. Now, this is easy. I'm just going to sample my warm, drop the hue away from that a little bit, and I'll just keep the same color selection, and I'll just paint this swatch. And I'll drop it again and paint this swatch. And I'm doing my best to mentally try and be even as possible. In fact, maybe I'll go to my cold now, and I'll go up this way and up this way. And hopefully in the middle, I have reached a middle point on my hue chart here, my hue picker, the color wheel, or in this case, the color strip in Photoshop. The color order is the same, in case you're wondering. It's the hue strip, hue wheel. It presents the colors in the same order. And then right in the middle is right in the middle. That worked out pretty well. So this is a perfectly legitimate way of moving from warm to cool. Now, it may remind you of a theme park, maybe like a lollipop your kid would get at a theme park. It's loud and noisy and not necessarily, there's nothing subtle about it. And that presents issues later down the road. But this is our first and easiest way of moving from warm to cool and back. So what I mean is, let's say I'm painting with this color. I'm blah, 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 painting, a face, a tree, whatever. And I say, oh, I want to get a bit colder. Well, I could pick that and go like this. These now have a relationship. I could say, okay, well, I still want to get a bit colder. I'll pick that color and go like this. And I want to get a bit warmer, so I'll go here. And suddenly I have a path. This little abstract painting I just did has a legitimate path from warm to cool. The viewer can trace it. Remember, the color harmony is that traceable link? Well, I've just built it with, 5 swatches there. Okay, let's do another chart, though. And I'll start with the same thing, warm There, cool there, same colors. And let's just go the other way. So I'll pick this and I will go like this. So you're probably ahead of me. You know exactly what I'm doing. I'll pick this guy, but now I'm going down this way. And this is another way of traversing the color wheel or the hue picker, whoever you want to call it, and getting from warm to cool. We are building ourselves that traceable path. Think this could be a bridge, right? We are building a bridge from warm to cool. And the viewer desperately wants to see this path because we see it in real life all the time. Like nature will give you pathways. Now this doesn't look like nature, these two charts, because nature is more subtle than this. And don't worry, we're going to get to the subtlety in just a moment. I'm going to draw, spoiler alert, I'm going to draw two more charts here that will be more subtle. But there's two very legitimate ways of doing it. And we have not touched the actual color box here. We've only touched the hues, but we've built the path from warm to cool. So again, if I were using this chart, I could say, sure, I could paint within the bounds of this range, or I could just paint with like this color versus that color, and like if I cropped this is just as legitimate a path from warm to cool. It's not as broad as our original path. Like I've cropped it, right? But that's kind of pretty. Those colors can work. And they're just hues, just hue based. So hopefully already we're feeling a little bit better about the complexity of warm to cool. It's really not that difficult. Now, let me crop that out again. And I want to show you how you can put that into use. So I've actually done a painting that kind of uses exactly that. Here it is here. Part of this painting uses it. If you look at the green monster character, and we'll put this right up against our little palette here, can you see how that green monster is essentially from light to shadow throughout the whole character is based on, at least, there is a bit more color on him than just this, but can you see the presence of those hue shifts? In light, I have the warmest colors. We'll talk about how, in a moment, we'll talk about how light can influence the color temperature, since the light is a big player in why you're choosing certain temperatures, but that's for the next little section. But can you see how the monster in light is firmly in the realm of these yellows? In fact, I would probably have to crop it a little bit wider, probably like this. The green monster in light is represented by, say, these two swatches here. And yes, there's a few reds, but again, I'll get to that in a moment. And then in shadow, we are quickly traversing over to the cool side. And these little, the cool side being represented by probably the last, say, 3 swatches. You can really see those colors present on the monster, right? And then in the middle, there are these transitory colors, let's say, these middle colors. And those are also peppered in. They help that transition. You do need them. You can jump from one extreme to the other, but you got to be very careful when you do that. So I do like to include, you have to be sneaky about this sometimes, or sometimes you could just be overt. But I do like to include the middle colors that are, building that bridge from warm to cool. Again, the green monster, I think, is a pretty clear example, just for now, to give you an intro flavor of this before we go in and actually paint something. Okay, but we're not finished here. We have to get more subtle with these charts, like I said, remember? Okay, how do we do that? Well, we have not even talked about saturation yet. So let's do the same thing. Let's grab our warms. Let's grab our one warm. Let's grab our extreme cold in our hypothetical painting here. These are like palettes we're building, right? And in the very middle, somewhere around here, I will get a perfect gray. Now, when I say perfect gray, let me just cut to the color wheel for a quick second. You may be used to seeing a color wheel that looks like this, which just shows you the hues. And we talked about this, a few minutes ago. I'm going to suggest, though, that you throw this out for now and instead look at a color wheel that looks more like this. The only difference is that this color wheel also shows you levels of saturation within each hue. So take any hue, say red, for example, and over here you have maximum saturation, maximum chroma, and then we are progressively neutralizing that as we go back, and then we have this perfect gray in the middle. Gray being, if I sample it, you can see that there is 0 saturation to it. So what this means is when you sample a 0 saturated color, it can be any hue. Every hue has this gray in common. Now that's extremely powerful, that concept, because that means that this gray, this guy right in here, is our passport from color to color. Think of colors like countries. Well, this is our passport. You go through the gray and you can go from one country to the next, one color to the next, any color to any color to multiple other colors. Like you can go from purple to gray, and then branch this way, branch that way. You can do anything from gray. It's extremely powerful. So what we are going to do with our next chart right here is we are going to build our bridge from warm to cool through the gray. So that's why I've put this perfect gray here in the middle. And now I will take my first swatch there. And this time I'm going to decrease saturation, but I'm going to keep the same hue, right? The top two charts changed hue. Well, now I'm not doing that. I'm just changing saturation. And this, there we go. Let's keep the value the same, a bit lighter. And let's now grab this and we will go back this way. Same idea with the blues, obviously, just decreasing saturation as we go. Got to be a bit aggressive here to get to gray. There we go. Now this is a more subtle way of going from warm to cool and back, and I hope you can just see that visually. Can you see it, how it's not as candy coated? So this chart is much closer to how nature does it. Nature tends to go through the gray much more than the candy coated hue shifts. And as you can see, there's room here for one final chart, and you may have guessed what I'm going to do, but let's start with our usual warm versus cool. And this time I will still put this gray right in the middle. But we are now going to reintroduce the hue shift, so as well as saturation. Now I am going to drop it this way and reduce saturation. And before you ask, no, there is no specific number of units that I'm dropping this. I am just eyeballing it as I go. And that's not even a rule, by the way. Like if you're creating these swatches, it doesn't have to be perfectly even. It's the trajectory that matters. I'm just doing it evenly so for the sake of this diagram, a bit easier to understand. Let's drop this value just to match our chart here. So let's go to the blues now and follow the same procedure. Got to move the color picker up in hue and lower in saturation. Hopefully arriving at pure gray in the middle. Something like this. And, you know, it could be a good exercise just to try this. Try making this swatch chart yourself. And there we go. There, ladies and gentlemen, we have the extent of my color theory. When I say my color theory, this is all I use. You can figure out any lighting, any palette using these methods of going from warm to cool. All right, we are in the final section of this class. In the last section, we talked a lot about lighting and color. We'll continue that conversation in this section, though in this painting, I want to invent a kind of impossible lighting scenario, or one that is extremely caricatured and fantastical. But it will be rooted in storytelling and good composition, which makes this painting a nice way to kind of round out the class and bring it to a close. The medium for this painting will be acrylics, both in its airbrushed form as well as painting with a regular brush, and I'll even throw in some colored pencils in the last half of the painting. So it's kind of a mixed media project in that sense, but it's a ton of fun to work with. Let's get to it. Okay, so we're about to embark on painting this traditionally with acrylics, and the first step of that is to get a drawing on the illustration board to paint on top of. Now, the last thing I want to do, because I've got this all worked out, I want this exact drawing. I don't want to redraw this where I'll make mistakes or it won't be perfect. It won't be exactly like this. I spent so much time on this digital painting, probably a bunch of hours painting this. I want to get the exact drawing on the board, so I have to transfer it somehow. Now, I don't have any special carbon copy paper or anything like that. I just have a regular 8x10 inkjet printer at my disposal here at my house. And I'll show you my little homemade DIY way of transferring stuff. It's very low tech, but it works great. So the first thing I'm going to do is, this is my original painting. I'm going to throw it to grayscale mode. And then back to RGB. I could have just desaturated it, but there it is. I will just crush the levels because I don't want my printer to start trying to print all of these values. It'll just run out of ink. So I'll just completely do this, just enough so that I can still see what's going on, right? That's good. Now what I want to do is, let's see here. I want to make sure that if I go into canvas size, I want to determine the final measurements of the finished piece that I want. For example, if I just start printing this, my final piece will be 27 inches long. That's too big. I don't need it to be 27 inches long, and I don't need it to be almost 14 inches high. So I first need to know how big I want this thing to be physically. Okay, in order to know how big to print our file, I need to know how big I can physically afford to paint it on my traditional painting board. This is illustration board, the same board we used in the watercolor example, that double thick PK5 Peterborough board. Love this board. So I have, this is the only piece I have left in my studio. I'm gonna have to stock up again. But I've got my tape measure. I've got the board and I'll measure across, and I've got 20 and 3/4 inches that way. 20 inches that way. Okay, that's a clean 20 inches that way. So what I want to do now is make sure my file is at most 20 inches long. But actually, I'll probably want to go in a little bit, because remember how I taped off the watercolor to have this nice clean edge around when the illustration was done? I want to do that again with this. And I'll want to have at least an inch on either side of tape to have a nice clean white edge. That'll help if we get this framed. It'll help the framer have something to mat around, things like that. So what was this again? This was 20 inches. I'll subtract 1 inch per side. So that's 2 inches from that, leaving me at 18 inches, which is about, it's about there. That's pretty good. That'll be a good size. I'm just kind of looking at it and imagining my painting filling up that space, and that's about right. That'd be nice. So I will go back to the computer now and make my file 18 inches long, and then whatever height that ends up at. Obviously I have more than enough height on this board to accommodate whatever it ends up at. So it'll be 18 inches long by whatever. Photoshop will determine that. So let's go back to the computer and make that happen. Back here in Photoshop, I will go into image size, and let's resize this. Let's go 20 inches. Let's just bump this up a little bit, 150 DPI, just to give the printer a little bit of something to chew on there. Okay, 20 inches with, no, it wasn't 20. Silly me, it was 18 inches. And then Photoshop automatically determines the height, right? Because of the ratio. 18 inches by 9. Perfect. Okay, so this is the file that I can go to print with. Although not quite yet, because it's way too long. Remember, I only have an 8.5 by 11 printer. But on those printers, you never really get a full bleed 8.5 by 11, so I round it down to 8 by 10 inches. Here in North America, that's called letter size. In metric style measuring, the closest neighbor is A4, although it's not exactly the same. So here is what I will do. I'll enable my rulers, which you go, actually I don't even know where those are. I push Control R in Photoshop. As you can see, I can draw a little guide here, and you see at the very end, of course, I have 18 inches. My ruler ends at 18, and vertically, my ruler ends right at 9 inches. So what I will do is draw a ruler, or bring out a ruler, or a guide, I think as Photoshop calls them, to the 10-inch mark. So right there. See, I'm trying to line it up right there with the 10 inches. Perfect. And next, after that, I'll bring a guide vertically down to the 8-inch mark right there. So that means that this little square right in here, that's an 8 by 10 inch print. And of course, this neighboring square is not quite 8 by 10, but we know it's 8 inches long, and then by whatever it is. So here's what I do now. I make a new file. I have to remember the DPI of this. What was it? 150. Okay. So now I make a new file at 150 DPI at 8 by 10 inches. So there's my new file, 8 by 10 inches at 150 DPI. Hit OK. And I will rotate this, actually rotate it this way. That's how I laid this out, right? I turn on snapping. So that means my selection will snap to these guides. See how it snaps right in there? Click, click. Select out this 8 by 10 piece. I'll just push Control C and Control V, and it'll perfectly fit in here. As you can see, it is a perfect fit because I mapped it out as 8 by 10 there. So that's layer 1. Then back over here, I select my next piece right here, hit Control C and Control V. That's my next piece. Let me just hide the first one. So my next piece, let me just bring this in to the side because I don't need it to be in the middle like that. You'll see how this all works after I print it, I promise. If you feel like you're in the dark now, don't worry, it will all become clear. Now, unfortunately, we have these bottom pieces that are just over our paper size. So I think what I'll do, I'll grab this one here. I wonder if I grab this, Control C, copy it, paste it in here. And what I'll do with this one, I'm going to be a bit tricky. Again, you'll see how this works in just a second if you don't already know. I'm going to rotate it. And I'm going to bring that right over here to this side of the print. So I have space here. I can print two things on one page. There we go. In Photoshop now, I have page 1. I don't need my background layer here. I have page 1 and I have page 2. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to save those out accordingly. File, save as, and I'll choose a PDF format, which is right there. I'll just call it print 1. Unclick layers. We don't need layers. Print 1. Hit OK to that. That's all fine. Make sure high quality is selected up here. High quality print, or the top high quality print. Make sure that's selected. Save PDF. And then simply hide that layer. Include that layer. Same thing. File, save as. Select your PDF format. There's print 1. Let's just rename that to print 2. And you can get rid of layers again. Hit save. Same stuff. And there we go. Now with our 2 files, we can go to the printer, and these will print nicely on 8.5 by 11 pages. And here is my incredibly unreliable printer trying to print this thing. That's right, I had to solve a paper jam before this, because of course I did. But there's one of the sheets. And here's the result of our print job. Looking good. Now I have to arrange these perfectly together, so I have to get rid of some of those white edges, so out come the scissors. I didn't film the cutting process because you all know how to use scissors. So here we go. Now I'm assembling the world's easiest puzzle. Now I didn't print the bottom left piece because I didn't need to. It's just abstract ground brushstrokes. There's really nothing to draw there, so I left that out. It would have wasted a whole sheet of paper for nothing. So there's the assembly, and now I just tape that together. And there we go. Just some regular old Scotch tape will do the job. And as you can see, it's one held together piece. Switching over now to cutting the board, and yes, that is a table saw. Super overkill, I know. But it's the only tool I have that can cleanly cut this board. My scissors just tend to mangle the edge. So anyway, here I am just measuring. Remember that one side of my board is already 20 inches, so I don't have to cut that side. And there I'm just measuring, my illustration's 9 inches, and then adding 1 inch on either side. So I'm cutting a 20 by 11 sheet. And there's the cut. That big thing I'm sliding is called a crosscut sled, by the way. Super helpful if you're into woodworking. I highly recommend you build one for your table saw. And there's our board. On the ground behind me are goat droppings. Here now at the laundry room sink, I'm doing a little trick I learned from Drew Struzan. That is, wet both sides of the surface so that you pre-shrink it. Now you're wetting both sides because, as you probably know, when you put water on one side of paper and the water dries, it'll pull the fibers together on that side, which ends up bowing the page. In this case, it would bow that board significantly. So wetting both sides will cancel that process out as it dries. Pre-shrinking the board like this will help because, first of all, I'm about to apply a heavy coat of gesso to prime the board, and then, of course, the paint that will follow, and all of that will be taking place on one side of the board, so this pre-shrinking is kind of an advanced precaution against any kind of bending and warping later. And I'll just put it there against the window, making sure there's air access on all sides so it can dry for about an hour. And while that's drying, let's go back to our drawing here. That is a bottle of graphite powder and a paper stump, those ones you use for blending. I think they're also called tortillions or something. Anyway, I don't really use those ever, except for when I'm preparing paintings like this. I have flipped the drawing over, and then I'll get a good helping of the graphite powder on my paper stump there, and just start burnishing the back. I will speed this up greatly for you because this is as boring as watching paint dry. The only thing to make sure you're doing here is just getting an even coating. I mean, it's messy, but get an even spread all across your drawing, making sure that especially the important parts have a good helping of graphite powder there, because of course that is what will transfer our drawing onto our board. Speaking of the board, it's dry now, and look at that, straight as an arrow. That's what you want. All right, so back at the art desk, I've used some electrical tape. I didn't film this. I used some electrical tape around the sides. You can see there, kind of 2 strips of electrical tape per side. The electrical tape cuts in by 1 inch on every edge, which of course brings me to my 18 by 9 inch painting. So what I'm doing here is I'm gessoing the board. If you've never heard the term gesso, that's the product I use right there on the upper left. Now I also want to tone the canvas at the same time, get rid of the white. So I'm mixing my gesso with just regular acrylic. That's Payne's Gray that I'm using. You can see me squeezing it onto my brush right here and just wiping it onto the board. Now, what makes gesso special is that it's a certain kind of acrylic primer. The purpose of gesso, if you've never heard of it or used it, gesso just prepares a board to take acrylic paint. That board is very absorbent, which made it fun for watercolor. But if you were to paint acrylic on here, at least your first few layers, you'd kind of be fighting with the weave of the board. It would absorb the paint too much. So this gesso kind of prepares the surface with a bit of a harder yet still absorbent surface for the acrylic paint. I'm trying to be random with my strokes because this gesso layer will inform how the final brushwork goes down. A lot of people are very neat and tidy here at this gesso stage, and that's totally valid. I just happen to be the opposite. Also notice that I'm putting in a bit of a value shift here in the gesso stage. If you recall our little theory section from previous, the painting kind of goes from light to dark, right? Light on the left, dark on the right. Well, I'm priming it that way. I'm mixing in more Payne's Gray paint on the right, and that will just help me with the very first actual painting step. You'll see one of the first things I want to do here is kind of set the tone, literally, color-wise and value-wise. So instead of having to really load up on dark tones, going down from white or very light gray, I'll just kind of let the gesso stage get me halfway there. And I'm just doing a single coat of fairly thick gesso. You could do this in multiple thinner coats, but I'm good with just one thick coat. And when I'm done, I'll let it dry for at least a couple of hours. Perfect. With that done, I'll take my drawing with the burnished underside there, I'll flip it over, and very carefully position it onto my canvas. Sorry for the out of focus bit here. I forgot to set my camera to manual focus. I do fix that in future shots, so you don't have to deal with intermittent out of focus. Anyway, with the drawing positioned, I just scotch tape it down to the board, just, taping it in, several places to make sure that it doesn't lose its registration, because I'm about to start tracing this. And obviously registration is critical. So a bunch of pieces of tape, there's like 6 or 7 pieces on there to make sure that that drawing is not going anywhere. Then here, I'll just grab a good old ballpoint pen. There is nothing special about that pen, and I'm starting to trace the drawing here. But the reason I use a pen is that it's got a sharp tip, and that sharp tip will, probe into the paper and essentially push the graphite on the other side onto the board. So it transfers it really well. I used to do this with a pencil, but sometimes you'd think you're transferring it, but you lift up the page in the end and you didn't get half your strokes, or, half your strokes didn't come through strong enough. So a good ballpoint pen, and I use black because I can really tell where I've been. It's amazing. You start tracing this stuff and it's hard to know what you've missed or what you've gotten to already, but the black ballpoint pen solves all that. Just to show you here, I would usually not do this, but there's the drawing transferring onto the board. It's pretty light, and that's probably due to the specific type of graphite powder I'm using. I looked on the jar to see if it's labeled like 2B or HB or anything. I couldn't find a label like that on my graphite powder, but safe to say it's a pretty light graphite powder. But I do kind of enjoy that actually, because it doesn't blend very much, which is great because when I'm drawing and tracing the stuff, I'm putting some weight on my hand, which is pressing on the board. But I find that doesn't actually transfer that much graphite onto the board. It's kind of just relegated to the pen tip. So in this close-up, you can kind of see what I'm focusing on. I scribble my way around a lot. I try to make very definitive lines where there is a strong contour, like around her head, around her scarf, and around her body. But where there is just general tone suggestion, like inside her cloak, is just kind of a general tone, like right here, what I'm doing right here. I'll just kind of indicate that with some hatching. Her cane is a much darker tone, so I've indicated that with just stronger hatching. The lines are closer together in the hatching process there. Her hair is basically white, so I'm kind of finding a few hints of shadow that are in her hair and just throwing those in. But otherwise, I'm pretty loose with this. This is a very preliminary transfer of the drawing. I will go back in with a stronger pencil after this, like right on the board. I'll remove the paper and kind of continue the drawing on the board itself, where I can just use my own eyes and not have to rely on tracing like this. Because there's no way I could trace every little brushstroke onto my board. And even if I could, I wouldn't be interested in doing that. Because the thing about this process is so much of the charm, whatever charm existed anyway, in my original illustration, a lot of that has to do with, a lot of the brushstrokes that I found in the digital process. This is a different process. I'm painting not with digital at all. It's the opposite. With traditional acrylics, very different tools. Therefore, my traditional painting, what I'm about to do here, I have to achieve the same charm differently. I can't copy my brushstrokes, like I said earlier. What I do want to transfer over totally faithfully, though, is the shape choices, the composition choices that I made. And a lot of those were made using digital tools, things like moving things around, selecting, resizing, maybe some warping or liquify tool. You saw me use all these tools in the previous chapter where we did that digital painting of the bar scene. A lot of my composition choices, don't come from the initial sketch. It came from the whole digital process. So this transfer technique is a way of making sure I get that 100% on the board right away. So when I go to paint it, I can focus on making, brushwork choices and getting that charm in, like I said. Because again, even the values are all worked out as well. So I don't have to really struggle with that either. It's all there from the digital piece. So this is a great way of producing an original, traditionally painted work, but also harnessing the power of fluid decision making, let's say, that comes with digital. You can change your mind so much using digital tools, and I find it a very good way of arriving at maybe better choices because you can iterate more digitally. And then here, just going back to the board and getting all those the power of all those good choices onto the board without having to fuss around with that with acrylic. And that's because with traditional paint, there's really only so many layers you can do before the paint starts to fight against you. And my personal technique of enjoying searching on the painting itself, it's really only good digitally. You can only do that to a degree with traditional media. And I do that to a degree when I use traditional media. Like when I'm sketching in my sketchbook, I don't do it digitally first. I do search on the page. But when I'm doing a final illustration, I do find it benefits from, at least for me, working through the problems digitally first. But in order to foster some kind of creativity when I go to work on this painting, because this, after all, is a new piece, look at the way I'm transferring a lot of these strokes here in the background. Look at the way I'm holding the pen. I'm not at all concerned with accuracy, really. I'm just getting my shapes more or less in the right place and just scribbling in very, very roughly what the composition is, where the shapes go, the size of the shapes, things like that. And this very rough transfer will allow me some degree of creativity when I go over the drawing again, which I'm about to do, just with a regular pencil. Now, I was a bit more careful where the focal point is, like where the grandmother character is there with the tombstone. I held the pen properly there and I tried to get shapes, a bit more exact. So I used a bit better drawing technique there. But here, look at this. I'm just scribbling in the sky. There's no reason to scribble in the sky, but I want to remind myself that there is a gradient there and I want to kind of remember to have fun with this. Now that we are done with that step, I can peel off my reference drawing. Now, I don't quite throw that out just yet. I do use it's handy to use as reference. It's not a perfect print. Remember, I roofed. I really lightened it so my printer didn't have to print so dark. But it is useful for some general shape reference if I get lost during the acrylic process. But there's the result of our graphite transfer. Pretty decent, but these are very light strokes. I don't know if you can quite tell that on the camera. But it's time to move to the next step of the pre-production process here, and that is with a good old graphite number 2 pencil. This is just a dollar store pencil. I literally bought it at the dollar store. I use it for just generic drawing purposes. It's a classic grade school pencil with the eraser on the back. And but it is a bit darker. As you can see, I'm going over my drawing here, and it puts down much darker marks than the graphite powder transfer does. Now, I don't have to go over my entire graphite transfer. I'm just going over the major landmarks of this piece. So obviously I'll start that process with the characters. Here's the silhouette of her dress, just a very important rectangular kind of design shape. Let's, recolor in the cane there, coloring in the dark shoes, not coloring, just filling it in with strong graphite. And as you'll see, some of the graphite that I'm putting down now, some of the pencil pass, will actually show through the paint. I do have the option of painting fully over it with acrylics, or again, as you'll see when I start laying this in with thin passes of airbrush and thin acrylics, that graphite, the values I'm putting down will inform my actual painting. So this black and white pass is very much, I'm in the mindset of painting. Like here I'm filling in a value for her dress. And again, that value will kind of get multiplied. It's almost like a Photoshop multiply mode. It'll get multiplied over the airbrush pass that I'll put down to start blocking this stuff in. So a lot of this is either silhouette line drawing stuff, like around her jacket, and some of it is actual value filling in. Like I also filled in a bit of a value for the cast shadow of the main tombstone. There's a bit of a value there. And here, just going over some of the background elements, mostly just quickly delineating silhouette stuff. No detail at all. I will get to all that with the actual acrylic paint. Very helpful, if not absolutely crucial, to have an electric pencil sharpener up there. Got to get that pencil back to a nice point. I also rotate the pencil as I draw, but gesso does have a bit of a tooth to it. So rotating the pencil helps keep the tip sharp, but that gesso will just eat it to shreds after maybe even like 30 seconds of work. And I am pressing pretty hard now on the pencil, trying to make, as dark of a mark as I can. Here I've just got my phone out, looking at the digital illustration there on my iPhone. What a 21st century way of working. But yeah, it's important to me to continue to reference the illustration. And you notice I'm using the actual illustration on my iPhone, not the print, because I do want to see what kind of subtle values and shapes I arrived at digitally, because that will inspire me to put in values and shapes now with the pencil. Like I said, a lot of these values with the pencil will show through, at least for the first bit of the painting, but that's important. Even if they ultimately get painted over, the fact that they will show through at first is important because it'll influence the direction I take, right? So make sure that the shapes I'm putting down are designed at least to a level that I'm comfortable continuing with. I certainly don't want a shape that's too generic. I want a shape that is, kind of faithful to what I had in my original, which is nice because I've transferred it directly from my original to the board. And then this is just sort of a refinement pass just to make sure I'm locking in on those shapes. But I mean, you can see how I'm holding my pencil. It's still pretty loose. Loose doesn't mean imprecise, though. I've spent many years practicing how to be loose and still make decent shapes and good brushstrokes or varied brushstrokes. So looseness for me is something I've strove to achieve literally for years. In fact, I'm much better at painting loose than I am at painting tight, and that's just due to the type of practice I've put in, again, over the years. As you can see, when I put in values, I tend to do it in a hatching style that is very directional strokes. It kind of looks like scribbling, and sometimes it is, but it's usually like this. It's directional hatching. I just find that gives a bit of order to what otherwise might look a little too unkempt or even downright messy. This is just a ground plane, which is angled. Just trying to get the strokes in confidently, which usually means doing them once and not trying to fuss over it. Okay, I'm speeding up this footage just a touch, just 1.5 times speed, just to get us to the actual painting portion of this. So I think you get the idea of what I'm doing here. Nothing too interesting, just going over little shapes, just making sure that knowing that the airbrush stage, which comes next, is going to cover a lot of this. Now, again, that pencil will be showing through. The airbrush is a transparent medium, at least the way I use it. But I'm making sure that those pencil marks are dark enough where they are important enough to show through. So not every shape is refined, but basically everything throughout the piece is delineated, let's say. This is like a background tree I'm putting in right now. It's got a very dark bottom and a kind of a lighter top. And you're not seeing me sharpen my pencil, but I have sharpened it like 15 times throughout this process. Probably ate through 1/4 of that pencil just with this 18-inch long painting here. Putting in a few marks, and then I'll just get lazy, just get my finger out and just blend in some of these values that are supposed to be masked together. Massing just means it's the same value throughout. So her face is kind of just a generic, it needs to be darker overall, and her coat needs to be darker overall. So I'm just kind of taking the pencil material, the graphite material that's there, and just blending it together. It'll all result in just values once I apply the color process, which I'll get to right now. So there's our finished preparatory drawing. I'm not going to bother applying any fixative to this. I'm just going to airbrush and paint right over this. I kind of want those materials to mush and blend together anyway. So let's move ahead and see how that goes. That is my airbrush. It's an Iwata something or other. Now, I have mixed feelings about a traditional airbrush. First of all, it's a fantastic painting tool. However, it is the most finicky little piece of equipment you can ever come across. You got to clean it before you use it, after you use it, unassemble it to clean it during use. You just can't clean it enough. So here I'm pulling every little piece off of it and throwing it into a vinegar and water solution. And I've got to let it sit there for about ½ hour at least. And if I sound frustrated here, it's because, well, I am. I mean, I don't mind cleaning my tools. It's just I don't think these things are built very well. You'd think this delicate needle would have some kind of release mechanism. I should probably just leave it unassembled between uses, really. So I give up, put the airbrush down, and I'm going to hunt for some pliers. Aha! Take this, airbrush. And look at this, it's still giving me resistance. But finally, I win. Out comes the needle, and it goes into the solution there. And it's not the needle that's caked with acrylic paint, it's whatever's inside the barrel. I do clean the barrel with airbrush cleaner after each use. It just doesn't seem to do the job. Okay, complaining time is over. Thank you for letting me get that off my chest. That's years of built-up frustration compressed into a minute. I'll let this sit in the cleaning solution while I go check the mail or something. Ooh, and look at this, I did get some mail. Can anyone recognize what these parts are for? If anyone watching this is a pinball enthusiast, you've no doubt identified these as pinball parts. My interest in pinball rivals my interest in art, So there's my traditional art desk where we'll be working. But turn around here, and there's the real fun part of the studio. To me, pinball machines are like playable sculptures. They are full worlds under glass, worlds you can interact with, complete with sculptures, toys, lights, electronics. I keep my machines on whenever I'm in the studio, and I don't even need to play them. I just enjoy watching the light shows. In the middle here, I'm building my own pinball machine. And to me, this project is just another outlet for art, really. It's got design and a composition that will be interacted with by the user. And what's underneath the playfield is just as interesting as what's above it. This project is nowhere near finished yet, but I'm excited because those new parts I just got, I'm looking forward to installing here, after I'm done recording this video. Off camera, I did some test spraying with my airbrush, and it was still kind of clogged. I haven't used it in a while, and I guess things really caked in there. So I pulled out a few of the tiny pieces that make up the nozzle itself. You can see them lying in the liquid there. Now that liquid is no longer water and vinegar, it is mineral spirits. So I've raised the intensity of my clean here. So I've reassembled the airbrush, and I'm going to put some paint into it. I've got these high flow acrylic paints. You can see it's very liquidy. So just loading the airbrush with some of that. This is titanium white. This is cadmium yellow. These are all very transparent paints. Here is a little burnt sienna. So I'm mixing the paints right in there. Then I'll just grab a brush and kind of stir them together. Trying my best to give you a close-up so you can see what I'm doing. Yeah, just mixing paint, very liquidy, in the airbrush itself, and then I can go ahead and spray it on. And as you can see here, I'm having some trouble with clogs in my airbrush. Very frustrating. I figured I would not edit this process out, though. I figured I'd show you. You can see those blotches of yellow that have been on there. This should be an even spray, but it's anything but. In fact, it's barely even coming out. And when it does come out of the nozzle, it's like spattering. It should not do that. So what I did just off camera there, I took out the needle entirely. So this is a completely open airbrush. That's just me testing the tone with a regular paintbrush to make sure it's what I want. And all I want to do here is just warm up the canvas with this yellow. So here now, without a needle, this is a totally unconventional way to use an airbrush. No needle, just pure spray, spilling out the paint as I go here like a madman. Just trying to essentially tone the canvas. And as I do this, you can see how transparent that airbrush paint is. The pencil completely shows through. What I am trying to accomplish with this preliminary spray is just set the tone color-wise. It's a very yellowy orange painting, as we saw in the previous breakdown before we started this section. And that's what I'm laying in here. In a sense, I'm contextualizing the colors that are to come. So by warming up the canvas here, at least on this side, I can paint subtly cooler versions of yellowy orange into that, and it will look bluer against that yellow. Whereas if I started on gray, like how I primed the board, even a desaturated orangey yellow would still look warm in comparison to the gray. But against that yellow there, I'm able to play with warms and cools off of that. These are the acrylic paints I'll mix traditionally and paint with a brush, these soft body acrylics. You can load these into an airbrush too, so long as you water them down. But because my airbrush is not behaving right now, it is in the mineral spirit bath again. And I figured I'll just pivot to painting what I can with some acrylics. I've already got that warm airbrush spray in, so I can paint a little off that. And then after a few moments of this, I'll pivot back to the airbrush, which is my process anyway. I go back and forth between applications and tools all the time. So laying down a little palette here, just a general kind of warm versus cool palette I've got from the right. That's cadmium yellow light. Then that subtle blue is called light blue violet. Then there's burnt sienna, cadmium red, and cobalt teal. And what I'm putting down now is titanium white. And again, these are all just regular soft body acrylic paints. A soft body just means that they are, well, they're a little more viscous, a little more liquidy. You don't necessarily have to mix that much water into this, although you can if you want to thin the mixture down, of course. So this is just a good helping of white with some cadmium yellow to keep it warm, like to keep the white on the warm side. And my strategy here is to kind of go for a full range of contrast as soon as I can. Now I'm not there yet. This white represents obviously the lightest part of my contrast range, and I will then, as my airbrush gets fixed, I will use it to lay in some darks of the figure and some of the shadows in this area. Also, the tree above her is very dark. I will lay that in quick. So in my first, let's say, half hour of this painting, if this were digital, it'd be my first 5 minutes because digital is faster generally. But in my first, say, half hour of this painting, and maybe longer given my airbrush troubles, I will get in a full range of value. Color-wise, I'm just mixing in a bit more cadmium yellow into the white just to keep the colors kind of bouncing around a little bit. Just like you saw with digital, I switch my color a lot. I'm kind of allergic to painting with the same color for too long. I'll cut back to my palette and you'll see what that looks like. For now, though, here's a wider shot of my setup. I'm just mixing on a kind of glossy piece of paper there, just disposable. That's some of that light blue violet with some burnt sienna, and you see I mix them to create a neutral. Then I want my neutral to veer cooler, so I'll use more of the light blue violet, mix that with white, and this is how I adjust temperature with traditional media. Now this will go right onto the yellowy part of my block in there, my color lay in, and that blue will kind of vibrate nicely against that yellow, kind of getting a warm, cool statement happening early. I want that to be a bit cooler, and there we go, that's better. I know we're far away from the painting now, but I'll cut back in very soon. But for now, I just wanted to show you the setup. You see the solo cup there, the turquoise solo cup to the left of my canvas, that's just water. And so is the little bin right in front of me. That little basin is water as well. And on the very right of the screen there, you can see my iPad set up with the digital illustration for reference. And I'm absolutely glancing at that at least a few times a minute to make sure that these temperatures are within range. Now that we're close up on the painting again, you can see how subtle these temperature changes are right off the bat. I don't try and go broad with my color. I kind of get subtle right away. Subtle meaning just slight changes of warm versus cool. Now, again, that yellow underspray that I did is really helping this. If these colors were on top of gray, you kind of they wouldn't have the same identity they do now. That yellow is an important base because against that yellow, you don't need to go so much bluer to feel cooler. Because the yellow is so warm, that's kind of your starting point. So anything even subtly cooler than that will look a lot cooler. And, even the slightest presence of blue will look very cool. Cool as in color temperature, of course. So like right here, I've mixed in a bit more burnt sienna into that blue mixture. And that's what I do with the palette. As you'll see, I kind of stem out from the same mother color. I start a mixture and I branch off of it. I mix right into it because that allows me to modify the mix to go a bit warmer, a bit cooler. And you can see that happening here. It's the same sort of mother puddle of mixture that I kind of branch off. You see, I'm branching off to the left, the bottom left there. This is a much cooler version of that mix. But some of that initial mixture is still on my brush. I haven't cleaned my brush here. And that will drive that blue to get subtly warmer toward the colors that are already on the painting. That blue is being warmed by the colors that are already on the painting, and that helps create and preserve color harmony. Let's pull up the reference here so you can also reference it. Can you see how the sky gets bluer the further it goes to the left of the painting? Then right near the grandmother character, the sky is a lot warmer because it's glowing, like the frame is glowing from that tombstone. Now that glow, I've only started to suggest the warmth from that glow. I will probably airbrush over that. As I record this, I'm not finished the painting. I'm kind of recording in stages. So I think what I'll do is airbrush the final warmth over this. And yeah, just building that tapestry. These brush strokes go down slowly compared to digital. So you got to go back and mix these things every time. I'm not even really changing my brush, which is not necessarily recommended. I used to be kind of staunch on having a set of brushes for my cool colors and a set of brushes for my warm colors. And you could even subdivide that even more. Have a set of brushes for your warms and lights, different brush for your cools and lights, then a different brush for your cools and shadows, and a fourth brush for your warms and shadows. And I used to do that too. But I just found that process kind of unbearable and unmanageable. It took way too much time, like mental effort away from the painting and, onto something that honestly is not even that important. As long as you are in control of your temperature, that is warm versus cool. So I'm mixing a neutral there with a combination of light blue, violet, burnt sienna, and white. It's not the colors that are important. It's the temperature you arrive at. This is a neutral. It's close to gray. Notice I just made it a bit cooler. I'm trying to paint this, trying to restate the sky around this character. And because there's a lot of glow, that warm reflected light producing a glow, that sky needs to be warmer there. It's almost like it's like a lens effect I'm trying to imitate, where if you have a glowing yellow light, it doesn't matter what objects are around it, that glowing yellow light is going to overtake things and kind of blow out the lens a little bit with that glowing yellow. So in this case, the sky doesn't turn yellow per se, but it gets warmer. That yellow forces the sky to get warmer. So that's what I'm mixing up here. And value-wise, the sky gets lighter than I had it. Although some of that airbrush took it down when I was spraying that airbrush. I definitely oversprayed into the sky. So I'm overpainting that now to recapture the silhouette of the character. And I will constantly go back to my palette. So there's a little bit more burnt sienna in it, right? I only have a few colors on the palette. And I like that. I only having a few colors on the palette limits your options as to how you get warmer or cooler. So I have a couple blues on there and really only one warm. I will add colors as I need them. Like I'll go back and add more cad yellow. But in this case, I'm just working on little specific areas. I didn't squeeze the paint out just yet, but I will as soon as I feel like I need them. But way more important than color, really, even though I'm interested in color, way more important than that is value. That character can only stand out if she is dark over light. And that's including, and that not including the hair. The hair is light over dark, but the skin tone, the scarf, the cloak, the socks and shoes and cane, those are all dark over light. Simple as that. Nice shape, clear dark value over a nice shape, the sky in this case, of light value. And then from here, as long as I have that condition in place, value-wise, I can vary the color as I see fit. And really, even just the act of varying the color will help make it interesting. Don't worry about if it's the quote-unquote right color. Just vary the color, and just that alone can make it interesting. Back with the airbrush now, I've loaded in a kind of a neutral, lighter tone, and I'm just using it to break into the right part of this painting. Remember I said I sprayed too dark there? Well, now is the time to lighten up. So this is a mix of, again, light blue violet, some titanium white, probably a bit of burnt sienna definitely burnt sienna in there to neutralize it. And because I don't want it to be too cold or too warm, but this is a neutral cool, I would say. It's definitely more blue than burnt sienna. And I'm trying to manage this transition, spraying into what was too dark to lighten it up. Notice how transparent it is, though, right? That my drawing is still there. And now you can see how the drawing is used. It's not used as a final statement. It's just used as a guide. That seems like an obvious statement now that I say it. But however, some of the strokes are still there, like the pencil strokes for the cast shadow of the tombstone. Those pencil strokes are still visible. If you looked real close, the pencil strokes in the old lady character, especially her cloak, those are still there too. It's just that the pencil gets like amalgamated with the paint and it becomes one thing by the end. So it's there, but no one would be able to tell. The goal is so that no one can tell what's pencil and what's paint. It just kind of looks like the same process. Just adjusting previous decisions. That's the name of the game, really, with any painting. Now, with watercolor, you can't really do this that much. So with watercolor is harder for sure. I think watercolor is categorically the hardest medium. At least it is for me. It's also the most rewarding medium. But anyway, I don't want to get off topic on that. You saw the chapter on watercolor. This is just me adjusting decision making. That sky needs to be a bit bluer, a bit lighter, just to have a bit more color temperature contrast. This area where the tree is, that sky gets darker. This is partially because I want that area to be darker in general to kind of act as a bit of a vignette. Like the way to achieve the effect of a glow is to make sure that it gets progressively darker, right? The further away from the glow that you get, it should get darker. So the top corner of my painting, first of all, we have a very dark tree there, but also the sky should be getting darker. And that's a tricky transition to manage. It still needs to read as a light sky. Like even though this is at night, right? It still has to be a lighter sky here at this part of the painting. Obviously on the right side of the painting, it's like just a traditional dark night sky. This is a very fantastical illustration. There's a lot of bending of reality going on here. But that glow effect is so germane to the initial illustration. Like this illustration doesn't tell the right story without that glow. So I got the airbrush back out. This is a mixture of the cadmium yellow high flow paint. You didn't see me load it, but it's the high flow paint with a bit of white in there. And here's some more white. Now this is the high flow white, which is not opaque. The bottle says it's opaque, but it's lying. It is not opaque. You'll see in a second as I spray it. It does make things lighter, but it does it in a very subtle, transparent way, which could be what I want. In this case, it is what I want because I can really spray a lot of material on there. So you can see what I'm doing now. And it's just barely altering the value. So it is actually useful. It's just not what the bottle says it is. It is not opaque. If I wanted to spray an opaque white, I would use the actual, medium viscosity acrylic paint or even high viscosity or low viscosity, sorry. The thicker acrylics anyway. That's how I would achieve a more opaque white spray. And obviously you water that down to your liking. For those of you who have never used an airbrush, this is a technique to wash it between colors. That's just clean water in there, of course made muddy by all the other colors. You just kind of backfill it by clogging the tip with your finger. Then I spray the rest of the water out onto a piece of paper towel. Okay, this is exciting. I've got a very wet wash on my brush. It's a bit hard to tell on camera, but trust me, there's a lot of water in this mixture, and I'll probably even add a bit more as we go. I want to just continue to probe into the right side of this painting. It's getting a bit late for that. So I have to make sure that, remember earlier I was saying I bring everything up together. Well, I haven't really been doing that. I've been content to let that side kind of linger. But honestly, that's only because I know where I'm going with it. Like I've determined that in the digital illustration. If I were creating this from scratch, like I was when I first painted it digitally, there's no way I could have the confidence to leave a whole half of the painting untouched. But because I kind of have the answer book in my initial illustration, I was able to leave this at a block-in stage. But now it is important because this is a different piece than the digital. I'm not trying to replicate the digital. This is an acrylic painting. I'm using different media. I do need to know what this side looks like because I don't want this to look like it was painted by a different person. So I'm blocking it in with, yeah, like a very wet wash, like I said. And that means it will fade back. Like as it dries, you can already see it happening. It will fade into the tones, the darker tones that are already there. And notice this is warmer. I just dipped into a bit of burnt sienna. You saw my palette. There's only one warm choice there, just the burnt sienna. And making sure the value's right by using white. And watering it down, just putting it in. I'm thinking the warm tones will go on the lower portions of the tombstones, the gravestones. Are they called tombstones or gravestones? I've been using those terms interchangeably, but I think they are different. Anyway, grave markers. I'm going to keep saying gravestones, hopefully, if I remember. And yeah, warmer tones on the bottom halves of the gravestones and cooler tones on the top half. That is a logical decision because the sky is cooler. So light coming down from the sky will illuminate top things cooler. But again, this is a more fantastical illustration. So logic only matters to a point. But this is just big, bold brushwork. Remember that in my initial illustration, the digital one, this was very blurred out. Now, I don't know if I'm going to try and achieve that with acrylics. I'm certainly not going to try and achieve it to the level I did digitally. Because with digital, I just used blur filters, right? I didn't paint it. I blurred it. But I could do that with the airbrush to a degree. But I guess that's the point. Only to a degree. So I'm going to paint it as if it were unblurred. You can see how wet this is, right? The water is literally running down the board. I have the board mounted pretty vertically on my drawing desk. But I will start painting. That's actually giving me confidence to paint this loosely back there because I think I will spray it later to achieve some kind of a blur element to it. We'll see how that goes. Again, as I record this narration, I'm going in stages. I have not yet gotten to that point. But this is looking like it's populating that background, which is important at this stage. And with a bit of that wet mixture on my brush, let's work into the warm yellows here. Just, again, managing that transition from the left warm half to the cooler right half. All right, going back to the palette now, I've added cadmium red and cadmium yellow there, and I'm trying to mix a cleaner. Oh, I've also added yellow ochre, which is what I'm dipping into there. I'm trying to mix a little flesh tone now. It's cleaner color. I'm not. There's a bit of blue, but I'm not quite dipping into my messy mixtures. I'm starting fresh there. Gonna go for a flesh tone for the character. So obviously she's got Caucasian skin, so it's got to be some kind of peachy, yellowy, orangey, reddish, whatever. I don't know, something in there, something to stand out from some of the tones that the rest of the painting has. I still want her skin tone to be influenced by yellow though, because there's a lot of yellow light that I've built into the lighting so far. So I got to make sure that there's a healthy influence of the yellow there. Here I'm just adjusting for value, yellowifying it, making sure that that mixture is wet enough with water, and then just dumping it into the airbrush. And we'll see how that plays out. Here's a little test spray. That looks pretty good. Let's try it on the character. Now, this will cover some of the drawing because I've used some titanium white in there, which is opaque. Well, all the colors are opaque, but especially once you add white, it's going to start really increasing the opacity. But that's okay. She's not hard to draw. I can always go back to my reference, but this will start covering the line drawing. But again, the texture of the graphite will still kind of show through. Also, the texture of the board is still present, and I don't really want to lose that. Although if I do lose it, that's not the end of the world either. This is just kind of pure white, titanium white from the acrylic tube, though, not the transparent stuff. You can see how much more opaque this is. It's watered down, of course, for the airbrush. And I'm just increasing the glow, but also making sure that her hair reads as white hair. And if it's okay if that spills onto her flesh tone a bit. I do have light hitting her brow anyway, so that's okay. Pure white is too cold of a color for her flesh tone, so I'll have to adjust for temperature there. But it's okay if a little value spillage happens over there. I'll speed through this mix I'm doing here. On the palette, I've just added some yellow ochre to the mix. and I'm spraying that in. It's barely visible, but it is there, just to increase the skin toniness of the spray. And then I'll add that to the glow, add it to the side of the character's face that's lit, because I already had some of the white mix in there in the airbrush. And if you spray too long, you kind of see how wet the spray is, because you are spraying. I mean, there's a lot of water in the airbrush, so you are adding water as well. So if you overspray something, it can get too wet, and you have to wait for it to dry. And if that happens to me, like it is now, I'll just work on other areas. It doesn't take long for the airbrush stuff to dry. So yeah, just more work around the character, which is part of the glow, which is part of her. So compositionally, it all makes sense. Going in now with a mixture of Payne's Gray, which is a very dark, cool gray, and Burnt Sienna to warm it up. And that's just those two colors mixed together to create a very, very strong dark. This is about as dark as I ever want to go. That and the sky on the top right of the painting, which you can't see now, but you've seen it before. Getting in just some true darks, which I have consciously saved. I've consciously held off on these darks because I know that this is finally what will help this whole part of the painting pop. Earlier on in this demonstration, I said I like to get my values in, my full range of contrast in early. Well, I did do that in the whole painting, but I didn't do it yet in the focal point. I'm finally getting that in now. Remember from way back in chapter 1 of this course, one of the huge aspects of the focal point is it usually contains your highest point of contrast. So it is a bit late for me to get this in, but it's okay. Like there's no such thing as late if you have a good game plan. Like there's no reason to have it in early, unless you're struggling with painting process in general, which very well may happen to you. If that's the case, definitely by all means get your contrast in early in the focal point, and that's helped me on numerous occasions. But in this case, again, I have the digital painting to reference. I knew that this stage was coming, and now it's finally, it's time to get that in, these dark tones. So some of this is drawing, like I just kind of redrew her top sleeve, her arm, the sleeve at the top of her form there. And here I'm just building in the darks of her cloak, which got oversprayed with airbrush, or honestly, the airbrush, I didn't go dark enough with the airbrush. So just using a regular mixture now. Again, this is a mixture of Payne's Gray, Burnt Sienna, and also with the addition of Yellow Ochre. You can see Yellow Ochre purely on the brush right now. Again, I don't wash the brush between passages here. I'm just reloading it as I go. This was a pure helping of Yellow Ochre on the brush. I'm trying to get this subtle transition effect where like the middle of her cloak, like near the cane, is darkest, and it's that reflected light subtly makes the cloak get lighter, like here as I'm painting around the edges. So I'm using more like pure Yellow Ochre, which has a kind of a medium value around the edges, and then I'm mixing a darker value with Payne's Gray for the middle. And I'll overspray this later just to make sure the cane is not so hard edged all the way through. To me, the hardest part with traditional paint is edge control. With digital, there's so many just ways of very subtly modifying an edge. You can switch brushes with a click of a button. With traditional, it's harder to do that. You are by definition kind of stuck with a limited brush set, and that's great. I love the limitation, but it makes edge work a bit harder to come by, which is why I revere painters like the late Richard Schmid so much. Like his edge work was absolutely brilliant and beautiful and just changing all the time. And that's very hard to achieve traditionally. There are other reasons to love Richard Schmid, but that's a huge one for me. I remember even reading his book, Richard Schmid's book, Alla Prima. He talked about, the thing that troubles him about painting, the thing that's on his mind after 60 years of painting. It's not drawing, it's not values, it's not color, it's edges. That's the thing that he goes to bed at night thinking about. And it was a real loss to the art world when he passed away, but he left behind a whole legacy of amazing art. This, back to the painting here, sorry, this is a very wet wash of skin tone. You saw me mix earlier, just dipping into that, wetting the brush down. I wet the mix down because I want it to blend in with what I had there before, right? There's no sense in totally overpainting it, unless you've made an outright mistake. But I think the tone that was there is good. It just needs to be a little bit darker and a little bit more saturated. So I'm achieving a subtle blending effect by using more water. I've constantly been wiping up that drip that's going down the middle of her scarf. That drip is bad because it looks like, I don't know, her skin is bleeding or something. So I don't want that drip. I'll wipe it up again in a second. Here we go, reaching for a paper towel. There we go. Wipe it up. Obviously, I have time to wipe that up because it'll take a while to dry when it's that wet. And here I just dipped into some more white and a bit of yellow ochre to get the light part of her face. Here's the reference so you can kind of see what I'm looking at form-wise. See how the top right of her brow really lightens up. Now in my painting, it's a slightly different color, but that doesn't bother me so much. Like in my digital painting, it's more yellow and monotone or monochromatic with the tombstone, and here it's more like traditional flesh colored. I mean, I may adjust that later, but little color changes like that are not what I'm going for here. I want my painting just to look right in and of itself. When I show this to someone, or if someone sees it hanging on a wall, maybe they're not going to compare it with the digital. And I shouldn't either. That's a real thing that can happen to you when you work this way. If you have a digital painting, don't try and think that your goal is to replicate it. This is a different piece. As long as it makes sense by itself, which is, and the way to determine that, because you can really get stuck with comparing it with your digital piece for one, but also it's very easy to get used to what you're creating and not see the mistakes. Take breaks and stand back and look at it. Leave the room for an hour and come back, take a lunch break, a dinner break, whatever. Go to sleep at night, come back the next morning and give it a once over with fresh eyes. And you have like 3 seconds to decide if what you're doing is good, because your brain instantly kind of clicks back into getting used to what you're doing. So that fresh glimpse after a break, those are invaluable. The other thing you could do is use a mirror or use your phone, take a picture of it, bring it into Photoshop and flip it around or something, and or use a mirror and just look at it in reverse, which I am not doing here. But I did that a lot with the digital piece, and because this started as a tracing of that, I feel like I'm probably going to get the drawing somewhere close to right. Building up the hair once again. What is this, the 5th time I'm addressing this area? But notice each time I kind of crack down on the subtlety. And these strokes, still don't think these will be the final strokes, but like they have a shot now of being the final strokes. So let's, make them look like hair, and not individual hairs, but clumps of hair. In my initial digital illustration, I do have individual hairs kind of coming off of that silhouette. I'll do that later, and I'll probably use colored pencil or chalk or something to do that, not a paintbrush. But here it's just getting the masses right, and that's including the scarf. Like these are like big planes and big masses of the scarf. Her scarf needs to be several steps lighter, which is what I'm doing now. This is a very wet wash, though, very wet mixture. So this will dry a little darker, blending in with the paint beneath it. But that scarf needs to be separate from the cloak, so I'm lightening it up. And then once I have the value right, I'll adjust for color. The scarf needs to be a bit warmer, I think, but I'll adjust that later. She has these little spindly fingers, and I'll start laying those in now. They wrap around the cane, of course. And because I've lost a lot of the drawing there with my overspray and painting, I want to get back in that drawing, so I'll do so via the shadows and her eyes. Like she's looking down, so it's mostly you're seeing like eyelashes and shadows of her round eyes. The ear will have a shadow to it. I'll get her nose in as well. And this particular mixture is not wet. It's actually the opposite. It's very dry. I just dap the brush on paper towel, suck the water all out of it, and then load it up with whatever mix. This is just a mix of burnt sienna, a bit of cadmium red, a bit of Payne's gray to darken it, but heavy on the burnt sienna and cadmium red side to make sure it's really warm. See how dry brush this is? Like I'm putting the brush down and barely any of it is coming off. That's a dry brush mix. And I'm doing that to, get some of the shadows behind the hair, like underneath the clump of hair. And we'll see how that plays out. And, with that mixture on my brush, I'm just kind of seeing where else it might go. These are just I'm just probing at different areas to see like, oh, does that work? Does that work? Because we're really building up this character now. And it happens slowly but surely. I'm more or less working from the general to the specific. Remember that you've been watching this very close up, but that's not a natural way to look at a painting. The viewer won't look at it like this. The viewer will see it from across the room, from several feet away. So it's important for you to step back and look at your own work from several feet away as well. All those tiny little brushwork pieces you're agonizing over, they'll probably just disappear when you step back 3 feet. This is what I'm looking at. And the question is, does this read? When I paint digitally, I do the same thing. I have a little navigator window. I don't think I mentioned that. I have a tiny little window on my other screen that I look at things in thumbnail. Like every digital painting has that navigator window. That's what Photoshop calls it anyway. And that's what I'm looking at here. Does this strike me. Like, am I attracted to this picture? Is the contrast working? It's funny, in real life, the colors look more subtle than they do in this photograph. In the photograph, everything kind of looks yellow or blue. It's not like that in real life. I'll try and capture that with different camera angles as we continue to work here. And now I'm back to this area of the gravestones, using the lighter blue to suggest maybe the tops of some gravestones and just flesh out this area a little bit more. It's also nice for those dark blue notes to have some lighter companions, the same blue but lighter value. And then this blue happens to be around the same value as the sky, so I'm like, well, maybe I can dot this into the sky a bit. And who knows what that looks like. It could look like even more distant gravestones up on a hill. Not that it's supposed to look like that, but it could. It could suggest that. It could suggest foliage or something else. But the point is, it's small shapes compositionally, which, as I mentioned earlier in this lesson, really do fit in this area to offset the medium shapes. Well, there's only one thing left to do now. This definitely means it's finished. And I guess the last thing to do would be to frame it, which I might just do with this one. I think there's a lot of nice passages in it. I like the colors and I like the brushstrokes. It's got a message that comes from my own family life experience. There's that transition there, probably my favorite part of the painting. And what also makes this illustration special to me is that I recorded it specifically for this class. It's been a while since I've done an acrylic painting like this, and I really enjoyed this process. And I hope you did as well. Thanks for checking out that sneak peek of the class. If you're interested in watching the full thing, be sure to check out creatureartteacher.com. Hope to see you there.